you haven't seen the last video, don't worry, it's not required to watch this one. So far, this is where we got up to. 2 different mobile devices can connect together. We can have 2 players that move around in a game and they can hit each other. They also both have stamina bars. This week, I'll start to finish the game by creating my own assets. I'll create a better UI system for the main gameplay scene, as well as a main menu, lobby system, and lastly bringing over some of my own character models and create my own art for the arena level. Then I'll move on to making the combat mechanics a bit deeper, and also do some general balancing as well. When it's all done, I'll then create a page and release it on itch.io. So today is the 16th of December, which means we have until the 22nd of December to actually get the game done. So today I'm just going to focus on getting all the assets and environments created and switch them out from the ones that I had downloaded for free. So first I started with the main platform here and found a color palette that I liked. I really liked the bricks on top of the one that I borrowed, so I stuck to the same kind of thing. Instead I created some bigger bricks in a different style that were more weathered and broken looking to make it look like people had been battling on it before. This was also done by creating each brick individually instead of just copying and pasting a pattern over. I then created the following for the base, and then imported it into the game. So the lava in the game that I'm using looks a bit too static at the moment. I'm going to try and create my own and animate that as well. I couldn't find any decent tutorials on making it, so I kind of just winged it. It's a bit average, but it'll do. I quickly swapped the player models for my own and resized it accordingly. As you can see, I've added an extra set of buttons and icons. In the top left, we have the health of your player's different hit areas. These are related to your helmet, chest, and legs. Each player will be able to see their own and not their opponent's, which leads into the new attack buttons. The player can strike their opponent for a high, mid, or lower attack to reduce their opponent's corresponding health areas. Lastly, the player will have 2 block buttons, one for high attacks and the other for low attacks. Both block attacks will protect the player's mid-hit point, as well as leaving each block with a single open window to be attacked at. Next, it was time to implement each player's animations, so I brought those over from Foot Joust with a few alterations. The idle animation was pretty good to go, but for the attacks I had to swap the running animation out of the legs and make them idle. Unfortunately, when dealing with different animations and color palettes for each player, it gets more complicated since each player has their own animation controller. Mirror only allows you to use one player prefab, making character model switching a little harder. So the solution to this was just to put the animation files in a resource folder. If the player is the second player's network identity, meaning that they are player 2, it will then switch out the player's animation controller. Next, I was able to implement the animations for the block buttons, allowing the player to look like they're blocking high and low. For now, I think we have enough animations in place, so I want to now move on to refining and deepening the gameplay. I can get back into polish and add any extra flares later down the track. The first steps will be making the blocks actually functional. Like I mentioned before, when using a block, it will leave a window open for the opponent to strike. I started by trying to get the player to ignore attacks at first. This initially only worked for the host, until sometime later where I forgot to add this little command line to update the player's blocking state to the server, which now makes it work. So I was able to pass through from player to player what type of attacks they were using, then check if they were blocking, and then check to see if they were blocking high or low. For example, if a player is blocking low and the other player attacks high, the player trying to block will be knocked back. The next thing I decided to do was just play around with some numbers for how far each player gets knocked back. The idea is that when hit in one of the 3 areas, the corresponding bar will drop off and the player's weight will reduce. When they run out of a particular health bar, they will stop reducing weight from each of the hits, but by that stage they'll still be very vulnerable. The other player will have to rely on attacking them in any other spots to reduce their weight any further. The next part proved to be a lot more difficult as I wanted to start testing some of it in a real scenario and make sure everything was starting to come together. When testing the game on my fiancé with both of our phones, I needed to come up with a solution to reset the game quicker, as the games were over too quick and closing the game and reconnecting became too much of a hassle to try and test it thoroughly. So the next thing I need to do is make players reset to the spawn point when knocked out of the ring. This will help make testing more functional and probably be incorporated into the actual gameplay at some point. When testing the game, one of the biggest concerns was that stamina drains way quicker than I initially expected, and recovering from stuns just leaves you stuck in the same position over and over again, making the player kind of helpless. The other issue was input lag over the network was pretty bad as well. So after some thorough testing, I made some adjustments. I reduced the amount of stamina used by the player when first pressing their shield. I found that when playing, switching shield stances became more of a staple of the gameplay, and that switching too often just drained stamina way too quickly. I also made stamina regeneration faster to help the player get out of tougher situations when completely low, as it became more apparent of how much you lose when also receiving damage from the other player. I reduced the cooldown time for dashing as it became more fun being able to chase other players faster, as well as another method of dodging players' attacks. I also then increased the cooldown time for attacks to make attacking feel a lot less spammy and more precise and decisive. Your stamina will now jump back up to a certain point when coming out of a stun to give the player a leg up, instead of being stuck in the same situation over and over again. While testing, there also seemed to be a strange bug with mirror and trigger animations. Every time a player tried to use their shield, it would just do this weird thing where it would flash for a second and then disappear, but the player was still blocking according to the code. This issue only appeared when running on mobiles and not in the Unity editor at all. I tried to double check everything and everything seemed to be completely correct. After looking online, I'm going to assume that it was a bug, as there were other forums out there with the same sort of issue. Luckily, switching to set bull for these particular animations worked perfectly fine. Testing these methods were mostly rinse and repeat until they just felt better. I'm not done for now, and I will refine them again once I'm closer to completion, as I think it's time to move on and do some other things first. Next, I wanted to add the little extra details and feedback to the user for combat. Things like hit detection, screen shake, and particle effects really help the player register what's happening in the game, and also bring it to life a lot more. When testing the game before, I could feel these things were missing, and it was hard to tell if I actually hit the other player or not. The first thing I started with was the particle effects that come up when hitting another player. I imported these from regular foot joust and loaded them into the game. There's a different effect for each type of attack and only play when the player successfully lands an attack as well. It will also not appear if it's successfully blocked. So now all of this is starting to make the combat feel a lot more cooler. I then created this little spark for when the player successfully blocks an attack, as well as this flash animation for when the player is hit. Now with those out of the way, I wanted to finish the rest of the actual player's animations. It was time to also import the animations for the player's attacks for high and low. I then created this one for when the player is stunned, this one for when the player is dashing forward, and this one for when the player is dashing backwards. After all that, I finally added a scoring system. I found that after playtesting, games were over a lot faster than I had anticipated, so the next solution is to set a timer and record how many times each player is knocked out. The person with the most points at the end will be the winner. But for now, the timer is still yet to be implemented. And then the last thing I did was swap these buttons around. I thought it felt more natural this way, like the actual button placements on a controller. I also made the buttons flip for the second player, which hopefully makes it less confusing. So now it's late on the 22nd when I set my deadline. How did I do? Well, it's done, but it's not done. For the most part, I have a perfectly functioning game where the primary gameplay idea, as envisioned, has been completed. After adding all the extra animations and flair, it's really fun to play, which is a relief if you put aside the only issue, that the network latency is kind of holding it back at this point. But there's also still more to do. It's not exactly ready for release yet. I still need to make a main menu which has a lobby and a matchmaking screen that's easier to use than these tiny buttons that I've been trying to connect it up with before. I also need to create some kind of short tutorial or just screen that tells you how to play the game. I also need to figure out how to make both players move back to the spawn, because at this moment I can only get the player that's knocked out to return, which leaves the knocked out player open to exploitation. I also need to add the countdown timer and get the game to handle starting a game over. And lastly, I need to create my own background art for the game as well. But before I do all that, I'm going to take a day or two just to work on the script and organize footage and things for this video before I start editing it. I also do have something else planned because I enjoy the gameplay so much and want to give everyone a latency as free possible experience. I'm going to port this to PC for local multiplayer that you can also play with the controller, but that will come out a little bit later. Now with all that out of the way, let's move on to the next segment. I present creating a multiplayer game in 3 weeks or until it's done. So the first thing I did was create my own background. Now we're using 100% original assets. I then finally updated the logo so we can now start setting up the main menu. So over the next few days I followed through Dapper Dino's tutorial on creating a lobby system. I was hesitant to start at first because I wanted to recreate the network discovery system, but I found that there weren't any decent tutorials on them at all. I decided to follow through with it anyway because I thought it would at least help me learn more about the actual mirror system itself. It was really hard and confusing learning all these new networking concepts, but I slowly started to get the hang of it over time. After finishing the tutorial series up to the spawning players in part, I ran into a few issues and got kind of stuck. During the process of the tutorial, I had to recreate the network manager and create a new spawn system separate from the default one that I'd been using before, which just kind of didn't work with what I'd already created. After hours later of analyzing the new code and trying to understand the new systems, I managed to rework it with my previous implementations. It's not as well engineered as the tutorial system now, but I managed to hack job some of my own code onto it and make it all functional and back to a point before I started where I can actually start playing the game again. I was then able to have the host display their own IP address to make it easier to connect to other clients. It's not as good as network discovery, but it does the job. But now my brain's a little overwhelmed and exhausted by all the coding and learning I've done, so I'm just gonna take it easy now and just work on the main menu's visuals. For the visual elements, I once again imported the same visual style from the normal version of FootJoust. I managed to reuse some of my buttons and created other UI elements using slightly modified versions. I also did other stuff like making back buttons to return from all menus, as in the current state it kind of just made it annoying to navigate. As you can see, I first made a little button down here in the corner which just adds a small link back to the first video in this series for anyone who wants to see how this game was made. Due to the networking being a little bit average at this point, I decided to put a little disclaimer down here and just also shortly advertise the PC port. Next, I created all of these panels here to shift between for people to learn how to play the game. I'll just go quickly through them so you can pause if you want to read them. Hopefully it makes it clear how to play along with the visuals I used as well. The rest of the stuff is mainly the same but just with an updated look. In this menu you can host or join a game. I then created this little IP entry box with a small note about how to get the other player's IP if you're having any kind of issue. For hosting, it takes you straight to the game lobby where you have two big boxes that show the players' names and their ready state. There is also a button for the host to start the game when all the players are ready. I also added on the screen a box that shows the host's IP. This box is invisible on the other clients, but the idea is that when a player hosts a game, they're able to give out their IP address for the other user to connect. At the moment, this little box isn't perfect, it just brings up the first IP address in the list, so if you're on PC with multiple network ports, it may bring up the wrong one. Since this is for mobile, it should be correct every time. I didn't know what I was doing with this, I just kind of copied some code online and couldn't find any solution. Otherwise, players can just find the IP address in their phone settings anyways. The following I didn't document much of, and it's kind of just from memory, but over the next few days I wanted to actually move on to getting the countdown timers and getting all the players to move back to the spawn point. I also wanted to change the way the score system updated, as I kept getting errors from the second player about not having authority, which if authority was enabled it would just double everyone's scores, so it was time to try and make it more correct in a sense. After investigating the code I stole from the lobby tutorial for a few hours, I found it was possible to store each player in the game into a list to call upon from the network manager later. I thought I completely resolved my respawn issue and struck gold and that the rest of the process was going to be a breeze, but it wasn't. I figured out how to get players to talk to the network manager, but when trying to call the same method for every player, it only worked sometimes. I wanted to call a for each loop on the network manager when a player falls out of the ring to tell all the other players to update their score accordingly and go back to the spawn. This only worked sometimes for some reason. I spent about 3 or 4 days on this, going through all the code I had, trying to understand it better and how mirror works and trying all the different tags and methods to make it work, while also dealing with a bug where the second player would just not spawn properly and bring up this message on occasion, making me restart the game and reconnect again just to test the tiniest little implementations. Other implementations just updated the score multiple times and made players respawn rapidly, causing each player to spaz out to the spawn, which just wasn't good enough. I was going in circles for a bit. I searched online for solutions, but with no luck for like a really long time. However, I did learn from the process, helping me familiarize and drill in more about mirrors networking. So in the end, it was all worth it. I eventually came up with a method to update the score correctly like this, and then moved on to creating the countdown timers for the game. I also eventually fixed the second player spawn-in issue. It was just kind of a shot in the dark, but I noticed a warning about animation appearing sometimes. I assumed that it had something to do with the animator and sprite renderer being referenced during the start method. I assumed the onStart client method was getting to the part where it changes the character's animations and look for player 2 before the start menu completely finishes setting up, which is where it gets the component for the sprite renderer and animator. So I just assigned those components in the editor like I should have in the first place and haven't had a single issue since. This part came pretty easy and naturally. I was still able to use the solution of the list of players from before and calling to every single one of them. This worked 100% of the time because I was able to use a series of coroutines and start method delays to get this to work. So now when the game starts, this loading screen appears for a second while the second player starts to connect and loads in. Once that has disappeared, this countdown timer appears and then activates the player's UI so they can start battling. The gameplay countdown starts, and when that is over, the game is over. All players' UIs will shut off, and now I need to decide what happens next. So I created this end screen for the players that show who won the match and how many points they won by. I still couldn't figure out the correct way to make the players respawn, so I went back to the old hacky way to just spam everything on the server because I want to release this game today and kind of move on. And also because I didn't mention it before, the player who scores the point doesn't have their health reset when sent back to spawn, so before you tell me it's a bug, it's not. It was intentional for balancing and challenge. Next, I figured out how to handle players exiting during gameplay. During the game over screen and disconnecting from the game, I had no idea what I was doing because the server and client handle these things differently, so I just made a forced hacky version that just worked and shut everything off without going onto any issues. The last thing I did was add a player prefab to record how many times you've lost or won a game. This would also appear on the main menu just like this. And that's it. It's all done. And as I take a step back and look at all my work and almost get it ready for publishing.
Yeah, that's one fine looking barbecue pit. Why doesn't mine look like that? Ah!
I then realized I completely neglected something. So I got this lava audio from Freesound and used it in the main menu. I didn't want to make a song for the main menu as I liked the atmosphere of just the bubbling lava. I was going to compose a song, but I had this chip tune piece lying around that I never used on anything before that I made, so I found it was cool enough to use in the gameplay. It was then time to add some sound effects. I once again browsed through Freesound to get something for the main menus. I then found the sound for when you push a button, this one when you go back, this one for changing the page in the tutorial section. And then for readying up a game, I found this one of someone rustling a piece of armor. Lastly, it was time for some combat sound effects. I had this original hit sound from Foot Joust. Then I took it and modified the pitch, the speed and other sound effects onto it. Then for the third hit sound effect, I downloaded a bunch to combine them to get this one from Freesound once again. Next, I didn't have to do any network related stuff, I just played them to the client only in response to attacking and knockbacks. For the hit effects, I put them in a list and got them to randomly choose one of the three. Lastly, I look for a sound effect for when the game starts. I thought this loud sword bang was a super satisfying way to start a match. And now, I'm done. For real this time. It's now actually time for release. So the first thing I did was create the itch.io page, and all the material for it, like screenshots. I then built the APK and uploaded it, so now it's done. I also then edited the trailer the next day, uploaded it to YouTube, and attached it to the itch.io page. The next part I had to do some thinking about. While I was happy to launch this on itch.io, I was kind of hesitant to put it on Google Play. Even though I am happy with the primary gameplay loop and the quality of the actual game itself, it is missing a major feature. It doesn't play over the internet exactly. It doesn't work through hotspotting either, or over like a large network that has massive amounts of firewalls like my work. So far, I haven't play tested it with my friends due to the fact it had to be played on a home network. I just wasn't sure if this would totally kill its release on Google Play and get review bombed by people who didn't understand it doesn't have this feature. But in the end, I decided to shoot. It's got to go through a Google review process before it can even go on the store anyway. So if it's good enough for them, then why not? So it took a few days before it was reviewed and ready to go on Google Play, but it did get approved. So now that it's out there, please go download it from whatever platform suits you the best. I'd really love to hear about you guys playing the game if you can with your friends. The game so far has a total of 9 downloads on itch and 2 on Google Play, but those 2 were me, which is honestly still more than I expected. I expected to get absolutely none at all, so I don't know who these other 9 random people are. However, if enough people play this game and there is some kind of a demand, I will consider revisiting for an online update sometime in the future when I'm ready to revisit networking again. So that's it. I have officially released my first ever game. It's a really weird feeling, but also really satisfying to have something out there and kind of show something for this hobby that I love to do, and I can actually say I completed something. Looking back, I definitely dug myself into a deeper hole than I initially anticipated. The overall experience of adding multiplayer is an incredibly steep learning curve compared to regular Unity, but I did come out on top even though I was close to giving up on several occasions. I really enjoyed doing something else and taking a break from my major project. Going back to that one is gonna feel like a breeze, to be honest. So I'm now one step closer to being game jam ready. So if you made it all the way through this much longer than usual video, I honestly can't thank you enough. I know I totally killed this channel in the process by not uploading for well over a month, as life gets in the way sometimes, and focusing on improving my editing of these videos has kind of slowed the output by a considerable amount. And according to my stats, over the last month we lost a ton of subs and have only grown by 1 or 2, so hopefully not all of you have forgotten me yet and I haven't completely been buried by the YouTube algorithm and this channel is now hiding somewhere where no one can see it. But for now, it's time to say goodbye again until the next devlog where I can return to regular old foot joust. Otherwise, you guys can contact me at any time to chat game dev. I will always respond to everybody.